Good morning. I hope everyone had a nice weekend. A little hint of spring, which unfortunately I think will disappear by tomorrow, but it's in our future. Spring is in our future. We begin with the fragments game. This is game 2. This is fragment 3 from the village. Okay. And I think I've put the first two, and I think this one are all now up on Blackboard in fragment 4. And so the people who participated in game 1 and got them all right all got a point added to their grade at the end. And the winning submission will get the prize. I'll briefly go over them with you. Not sure most people I think will remember largely what they are. I don't have the images on this particular PowerPoint because we switched, we delayed this a week, but if most of you will recall, image 1 was Hugh O'Neill's store. I gave you a full frame of it because if I highlighted just the little piece at the top, which is the fragment, it just said Hugh O'Neill's. It was I thought, a little too easy, but it was meant to be what it is. It's part of the Ladies' Mile on 6th Avenue, so a lot of folks will have seen this. It's across from, some of you have gone up and shopped at Bed Bath & Beyond, and it's across the street, so it's on the west side of the street between 20th and 21st Street. It was created in the late 1880s. It was one of the higher end department stores on the block. When we do the Chelsea tour, those of you who come along will discover the retail trade becomes very specialized, and they begin to develop all kinds of very different kinds of expertises and marketing techniques in those different stores. Today, the building has become the home of luxury condominiums. It was redesigned about 2 years ago, and so it has these golden domes on the corner. They were there originally and haven't been there for like 30 years, so the new developer put them back on top of there as part of this renovation. The basement has had a men's warehouse in it until recently. The second slide was actually on 17th Street. It's a building that backs between 17th and 18th Street, between 7th Avenue and 8th Avenue. And it's the warehouse, okay, the original warehouse for the carriage trade associated with the Ladies' Mile. It had, if you remember, the initials S and C on the top, and that was for Siegel Cooper. And I tried to give you a little more help with that. It said Siegel Cooper, and it's connected to the Siegel Cooper building, which is the site that you know for Bed Bath & Beyond today, and Filene's up until another week. Filene's store is closing. So that's the trouble often. If you Google next year, someone Googles that, although I expect I'll change the sites next year, will not have found. If they say it's Filene's, I will know you have not gone there to look at it because Filene's will not be there. In any case, that's the Siegel Cooper store. That was the most famous of all the stores there. When people in the 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, and Ladies' Mile only lasts about 20 years, but when people wanted to meet, ladies would say, "I'll meet you at the fountain," and that meant the fountain in the middle of the Siegel Cooper store. So it was a lot like the kind of central meeting place with the kind of allure today that Grand Central Station has as a kind of meeting place. So that was Siegel Cooper's, but the building I was having you look at was in fact the warehouse for the carriage trade in order to get all the goods distributed out to the consumers. And today, the basement of that building, the hint I suggested to you folks, is where the Barney's Warehouse sales are held twice a year. Anybody have any idea why Barney's Warehouse would be located there? Depends how new you are to New York. If any of you have parents who are New Yorkers, they would have known Barney's was actually located historically on 7th Avenue and 17th Street. That's the main Barney's store. It's now the Rubin Art Center for Tibetan art, which opened, I think, about 3 years ago. But Barney's only had one store for most of its history, and it was 7th Avenue and 17th Street. So the warehouse store that they used for their sales was just down the block. So that was fragment 2. Fragment 3 was easy. It was the Israel Cemetery. It's the second of the Spanish-Portuguese, or the third of the Spanish-Portuguese cemeteries. Remember, we talked about the Spanish-Portuguese Jews coming over in the 17th century. So this was, in fact, as they moved uptown, this was the hallowed ground, and it still remains so. And you see it now, it's overlooked, it's by high-rise condos, but that's the one space, obviously, that they've not developed. It is just hallowed ground, so there's nothing there today except the continuation of the synagogue, or the cemetery rather, which is no longer being used. The next site, 109, it had the number 109, and it mentioned the carriages and hansoms. Anybody know what a hansom is, besides an attribute supposedly of an elegant man? Anyone know what a hansom is? Yeah, it's horse and carriage, that's right. So again, it was for the carriage trade. And if you looked at the building, you'd have seen that it has wide doors, much the way you would, if you pass around New York and you see buildings with those wide doors, they were either for the carriage trade or they were former firehouses. Nowadays, they've been often converted into residences. The 109 was meant to be the giveaway. I suggested you need to know something about numbering of streets in New York City. If you're in London, all the cab drivers have to have, quote, the knowledge, which means they know supposedly all the streets. But you can easily have the knowledge for your cab drivers who half the time won't have any idea where they necessarily have to go. So if you go into a cab and you say to the cab driver, please take me to 331 West 23rd Street, they should know immediately that it's on the north side of the street, and 331 would mean that it's the blocks between the 9th and 10th Avenues. They would automatically ought to know that. They don't. So what's the magic? What's the formula? 5th Avenue is the dividing line. The numbers between 0 and 100 are the avenue to the east and west of 5th Avenue. So 0 to 100. And the odd numbers are the north side. The even numbers are the south side. So the 100 block has got to be between 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue, or 3rd Avenue and 4th Avenue. Since we're dealing with Chelsea, it's got to be the west side, so it's West 109. It's got to be between 6th Avenue and 7th Avenue, and you would have been able to find it. And it's 109, so it's an odd number, so it's on the north side of the street. So you would have had to go through 5 or 6 blocks just to find the 109, but you would have easily found it, as it happens, on 17th Street. Because I live on 17th Street, I see it all the time. And it's one of these things that the residents on 17th Street hardly ever see, because it's just one of these kind of fragments that's hardly visible, and it's not at eye level, but it's an incredible reminder of the past. It was a store, some of you noted, that sold soji screens, and if you said that, that indicated you hadn't gone there, because in fact, the soji screen maker who was there for something like 25 years couldn't afford the lease, and he closed down 6 months ago and moved out, so it is now vacant. It's a vacant space. But that's what it is with residences upstairs. The fifth site, the corner. Yeah, the corner of Coster and Bial. So again, many of you, in noting the 109, noticed and did research that Thomas Lord had built this building as a stable, and then it was later used as the carriage trade. In any case, the corner, Coster and Bial, was a vaudeville house. And the corner was only one piece of that kind of vaudeville house. It was used as a garden, as a back garden and place for people to sit and have beer at the corner of West 24th Street. So, and today, it's had a range of different people, pizza, bagel stores, et cetera, on the base. Some people noticed that at one point, if they did a Google search, they discovered the amusing fact that Billy's Topless Bar had been there for many years. But otherwise, it's again an indication of that kind of all vaudeville center. That whole area at the turn of the last century was the center of what would have later becomes 42nd Street. But the high life in America, which earlier, the period we're going to be talking about soon, is going to be 2nd Avenue, moves up, becomes in fact the area around the Ladies Mile and 23rd Street, all the way to where they have this very famous demonstration hall that many of you know about today, which would be at Madison Square. And what will that hall be called? Doesn't require a lot of imagination, gang. Come on, Madison Square Garden, right? Madison Square Garden. It is not located as its original location, of course, is where it was, Madison Square, you know, where the shack now to get your hamburgers is located, and all the fancy restaurants are. They maintained the name because it had a certain allure, and then it moved uptown. But its original location was Madison Square. Okay, so that whole area, all the way across to 23rd Street, which is where Tin Pan Alley has its origins, becomes that next vaudeville area for that next moment in New York City's history, which will be at the turn of the 20th century. So, and that's where Coster Bial's is, okay, as part of that vaudeville center. And the last site was a tricky little piece that I gave you, which was only a little fragment of a woman's face. The key, the clue on this one, I hoped would help you in terms of your Google searches. If film was made there, it would be called The Miracle of 14th Street. What was the film otherwise called? Huh? Anyone? I can't hear.
Miracle of 34th Street.
Miracle of 34th Street. And what was The Miracle of 34th Street about? Film buffs? Macy's. So this was the origin of Macy's. It was the location, by the way, in which the original department store Santa Claus was located, at that corner on 14th Street. So the giveaway would be, it would be Macy's on 14th Street, and you would find it just to the east of 6th Avenue, on the south side of the street. It's basically now an electronics store downstairs, and pretty dilapidated area. Places come and go. So there you are. Lots of people got virtually all of them right, with some bits and fragments and pieces slightly wrong, for which you all got credit anyway. I've let your discussion leader know your name, so you all will have a point added. There will be a point for each of the 4 games. Anybody who plays all 5 and gets them gets 5 points, which is, I guess, half of a grade boost. The winner is Amanda Starnes. Is Amanda here?
Thank you.
Please open. Don't worry about it popping out. It is the original Greek coffee cup. As you all know, if you get them in paper, when you go to any of the Greek coffee cups, only this one is obviously in ceramic. It's a ceramic coffee cup in the style of the quintessential New York coffee cup that you get. You can get them at places like the MoMA store and some of the designer galleries around the city, for those who want to have your own Greek coffee cup. All right, any questions before we begin? I'll be meeting with the discussion leaders later today, and we'll go over all your papers a bit and try to make sure there's a relative uniformity in the grading, so that none of you feel that you've got the hard grader or the easy grader, but that there's some kind of parity in what you're doing. And the intention really of this initial project is really just to give you some feedback, to know, in the words of the Puritan divines, whether you have gracious affection or whether you are eternally damned. I'm quite confident it will not be the latter, so you'll get some feedback from your instructor, okay? And the midterm will be 2 weeks down the road. Okay, health. Today we're going to talk about health and safety and what people did when they were displeased with the conditions. So New York City, thriving metropolis between 1800 and 1860. We're dealing with the period leading up to the Civil War in these next few lectures. Thriving dockyards. It is a commercial entrepot. It is a dockyard city. Okay? It is a port city. It is a port city, however, for the center now of a kind of global capitalist marketplace and the beginnings of an intercontinental market that can be developed through the canal system all the way into the emergence of the Midwest by mid-century. We talked about what the streets look like, the muddy, dirty streets with the pigs and the horses everywhere, including their refuse. Transportation was mostly by carriages, horse carts. People got their goods from vegetable wagons. And later, we have the beginning of mass transit in what will be called omnibuses, and they're largely going to be pulled by horses. And later, as we'll see, they'll begin to have some things on rails also pulled by horses. So horse cars, if you'd like. And that largely will be much of the transit through this first half of the 19th century. It was a noisy city, it was a bustling city, and it was a city with constant newcomers coming in large numbers to do the work that the city now had available to it. Seasonal labor, finishing goods work, and work on the dockyards, which was also seasonal in the sense that ships came and went, and they went in some seasons more than others. And the trade was there sometimes more than others. The growing pains of the city meant that people were often crowded together and helped spread disease. And if not disease, fear of disease. And fear animates the city as much as the bugs do. Okay? We all have a sense of that, in our recent past, whether it was from the 80s around AIDS or more recently about, swine flu. It's not just that you have the bug, but you worry every time somebody sneezes, stay home, please, don't come to school. None of us want it. Disease became as common as water, always problematic. And it worsened as the population increased, and as the scale of the city increased. The water system, remember that fresh water system just north of City Hall? That pond called the Collect began to collect. It collect crap, in the generic term, not the literal term necessarily, though that too. Its origins of collecting, as we talked about before, were simply the skins and the refuse of animals that were thrown in there from the tanneries all located around the Collect. But there was very little, as you recall, sanitation, especially among poor people. It wasn't provided for them to the extent to which our city fathers cared about developing social services. And they always were at best ambivalent because there was a privileging of the notion of self-help, that people ought to take care of themselves and shouldn't be dependent on the state. And rich people weren't terribly interested in being taxed to help poor people. So to the extent to which there were services, they tended to be disproportionately for the more affluent and less available for the poor people, who made up an increasingly larger share of the population. And there, on the whole, wasn't an ethos yet that accepted a kind of collective responsibility for everybody else. It was always limited. It existed around bread prices, remember, but even that will begin to change in the 1830s in dramatic ways that we'll be talking about today and quite poignantly next time. So the Collect fills with water, it becomes a swamp. And as it's built in, streets fill it in, and it becomes known as, it's a site where 5 streets came together, the 5 Points. The worst area to live in, because it was a swamp, because it collected water and was always damp and muddy, it was the least desirable place to live. So those people with the fewest means, as a consequence, were often there. They also were the people with the fewest personal resources to, as it were, get out or fight disease or get medical help, to the extent to which medicine understood anything, which is very dubious, again, fairly limited in all of these purposes, this discussion. In addition, New York as a harbor, as a port city, was a place that was always bringing in foreigners. It was always bringing in outsiders. It was always bringing in strange new things, which could include the possibility of disease as well. And new strains of disease. Remember, all of you, that's how flu operates. They didn't necessarily understand all that then, but we do know now that there are new strains all the time. So in fact, the population that's here might have become somewhat immune to the earlier forms of the disease, but because it's a port city, it's going to be the first site, the place of encounter with new germs, new disease. Epidemics erupt constantly as a consequence, and they're seasonal with the weather and the ships, and they sweep through the areas. Yellow fever was the worst initially, the oldest of these diseases. The virus spread from person to person by a mosquito. The name of yellow fever came from the fact that the skin turned yellow with the disease. Sometimes it was confused with other diseases like typhoid fever or typhus. And on the whole, it was thought not to be contagious. Okay? So one needs to understand how it was understood at the time. They thought it came from local conditions, like spoiled food or bad personal habits. Think of that broadly as like being an immigrant, bad personal habits. That's to say there was a kind of loose translation about what that meant. Okay? There was no need seen for quarantine or for urban evacuation, and they were leery about publicizing it or noting that there was the disease. And why would they be leery about publicizing it, do you think?
Bad for business.
It's bad for business. Okay? So there was always that kind of schizophrenic reaction. You both want to know about it in case maybe it's around, although you don't think it spread from person to person. It just happens. It's kind of divine punishment for people who lead bad lives. Okay? In that sense. But you don't want it, just in case other people think that it's contagious, to be spread too widely. The earliest of the yellow fever epidemics that we know about in New York was in 1702. And it's thought to have killed as many as 500 people or more. That, by the way, was a pretty substantial share of the population, if you remember what the city was like at that point. But through most of the 18th century, there's no major yellow fever epidemic until 1794. When there's a minor epidemic, what's important about it is that it leads the local citizenry to decide that they need to create a means of dealing with it, and it's Bellevue Hospital. So we have the creation of a major social institution to deal now with sick people in sufficient numbers to feel that an institutional response is important. In 1795, the next year, the epidemic kills 732 people just between July 19th and October 12th, of a total population of about 50,000. So we're talking about, again, 1.5% of the population is dying. Dying, that doesn't mean all the people who are sick, but it means almost everyone was likely to know of someone who had it. Okay? In 1798, the city has what's called the Great Epidemic. And between July and November, again, you'd think they'd have some understanding that it's tied to the season, but they didn't. July to November, it killed 2,086 people. And it occurs in several other years, but that was the worst year of them all, at least initially. So we now have a sense that, 3 to 5% of the population is sick and diseased, and they had to do something with it. Some of you may have recalled, I took this clipping from Thursday, November 5th, 2009, from the Washington Square News. Some of you may recall that in renovating the park, they unearthed a grave last year. The mystery of the Washington Square Park tombstone has been solved. On October 23rd, construction workers unearthed an 18th century tombstone in the southwest corner of the park. According to Joan Geismar, an archaeological consultant for the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, the gravestone was found 2.5 feet underground and bore the inscription, "Here lies the body of James Jackson, who departed this life the 22nd day of September 1799, aged 28 years, native of the county of Kildare, Ireland." According to records, they go on to point from the New York Historical Society, James Jackson was a watchman and a grocer who lived at 19 East George Street, which is now currently Market Street, on the Lower East Side. Research, they go on to note, he was a man of some means, not wealthy, but he had some personal wealth, piece of property probably that he lived on. The park site, why is he buried there? Of course, it had become the pauper's burial ground. So anybody who didn't have sufficient means for burial, or people who were nobodies, or people whose bodies they were concerned about any contagion, were buried in what was not then Washington Square Park. Okay? The area we're talking about was the pauper's burial ground, thought to be far removed from the city, and far enough removed from the city. So increasingly what you're beginning to see is a sense that people want to move away from disease or get diseased bodies away from where they are. And this is going to begin to set in motion anxieties about that will spur what we'll call social or geographic mobility in the city. And another element called residential segregation. People who don't necessarily, if they think the problem is the way people live their lives, if they think that godliness is next to cleanliness and godliness are associated with one another, then godly people or people who think they're moral don't want to be near people who are unclean, as they imagine cleanliness. So you want to live near other people who are clean. And so increasingly people are going to be more and more concerned about who they're living nearby or who's living nearby them. Okay. So all of this is going to begin to set some of that in motion, these kinds of diseases. In 1805, the yellow fever epidemic occurs again, and supposedly 50,000 people that year flee the city. So what we're now seeing is an emerging notion that maybe there is a sense of contagion. That while initially the understanding was it's just poor people with poor health, bad habits, you don't just flee from people with bad habits. You flee from people with bad habits if you think those bad habits could rub off on you. And it's not a habit, it's rather the disease they think is going to run off. So there's already a kind of tidal change in attitudes evident by the early 19th century that's now going to set off people moving. Okay? People moving. So 50,000 people start moving in 1805. In 1819, another yellow fever epidemic. The last important one is 1822. From yellow fever, as they increasingly begin to finally understand it's about stagnant water and about a mosquito. But other diseases had taken their toll as well and become as prominent as yellow fever, if not more so. And the major disease that we need to be aware of was cholera. It was the most virulent infectious disease in 19th century New York. And it was transmitted by contaminated food and water, and we had a lot of it. It caused diarrhea and vomiting, as any of you who've ever had food poisoning can attest. So it's hard to know whether you just have food poisoning or whether it's going to be cholera. But it was so severe that death was often by dehydration if the systems were untreated. And of course, the problem was if you were dehydrated, you needed to drink water, but it wasn't clear that the water wasn't going to kill you in New York. The water system was dreadful. cholera pandemic arrives in New York City on July 26th, 1832. It had traveled over trade routes from India, through Russia and Europe, across the Atlantic to Canada, then down the Hudson River Valley. So it's a global disease. And New York City was just a sitting duck, waiting for it to happen, given our trade, given the fact that everything was gravitating toward the city. And one could have traced it, and indeed, the New York City doctors, health specialists, knew it was coming. They followed it. They lived in denial, however, because they believed they had a fundamental form of protection called the ocean. Okay? They believed they couldn't get over the ocean. Somehow they hadn't thought about ships. Okay? So they lived in denial about doing anything about it. Now, the other thing I just, however, want you to remember is the date, 1832, because we're going to be spending a lot of time in the next lecture talking about the early 1830s. What is associated with the early 1830s for those of you who attend this university?
The establishment of
The founding of NYU. So just remember that NYU is founded, the date that's on your T-shirts is 1831. It builds its first building in 1834. So in the middle of all of that, we have this pandemic in New York City. That, however, is only one of a series of things that are happening in the city at that time. 1834, as you're going to hear later, in New York City is known as the year of the riots. So it's also following on this. 1831 and 1832 are years in which slavery is being abolished in the Caribbean, and New York City and America are among the last outposts still clinging to slavery and defending it at a time when they're being told by even their English brethren and the rest of the people they associate with modern civilized world that slavery is immoral. We still got it in this country. There are slave rebellions. There's the publication of The Liberator, the abolitionist press. So there's a lot of turmoil in the early 1830s, social turmoil that we need to talk about. And you need to understand that laid on top of it is not just fear set in motion by change, but fear that could be animated by real disease, okay? A pandemic at the same time. So you need to remember that this date is not insignificant. It's not just the disease, but it's a disease taking place in a city that's being transformed in all kinds of fundamental ways that we'll talk about. The city was congested, mostly below, almost everyone lived below 14th Street during this period. Indeed, virtually everybody lived in 1832 below 8th Street. Washington Square Park, which I'll talk about next time in a little more detail, is only created in what year? Does anybody know? It's the date that two presidents die. Jefferson and Adams both die on this date. They were in close correspondence with one another. And it is the 50th anniversary of the United States. July 4th, 1826, it is converted from a pauper's burial ground into a military parade grounds called Washington Square, named after the first president. And for the first time, the space in being redesigned is going to attract new residents. So in fact, there's almost no settlement even this far north, even up to this period. Who's affected by the pandemic? Mostly the immigrant poor, many of whom in disproportionate numbers are Irish, and they, of course, are coming in vast numbers from the 1830s forward. We know that they're going to come even in more accelerated numbers after the 1846 because of the potato famine. But still, the predominant numbers of immigrants coming are still Irish. The foreign-born population of New York City, just to give you a sense of this, between 1830 and 1850, grows from 9% of the population to 46% of the population. So it's a city, again, when we think about it being transformed, in which at the onset, 1 of 10 people around you is foreign-born. Within one generation, 20-year period, 1 out of every 2 people is foreign-born. And that's not talking about the people whose children are born here, but who are not counted as foreign-born, but are also part of an immigrant population. So the immigrant city, in that sense, is in fact overwhelmingly a characterization of New York City by mid-century, and it's being set in motion here. And it's also animating to what extent is this pandemic being brought over by these foreigners, by these strangers? How much do we associate it with them, with their bodies, with their behavior, with their attitudes? They live primarily, the poorest area, the 6th Ward, the 5 Points. Dark, crowded apartments, which were called rookeries. You're going to see a video about 5 Points next Monday. They use converted churches. They doubled up in apartments, which become the precursors to what we'll later call tenements. By and large, everything is limited to 5 stories because nobody was prepared to walk any further up. You remember, how did you get water up to the 5th floor? You didn't turn on the faucet, you carried it, and water is very heavy, a bucket. That's why women were strong. Human waste was by and large in privies located behind the buildings. And they were often used by as many as a dozen or more families. And if you were lucky, they were cleaned once or twice a month. So again, if you want to have a sense of the smells of the city, of the squalor in which people lived, of the dirt, and the potential for disease, one needs to understand what the social conditions of everyday life for the majority of New Yorkers was like. We're not talking about Astor. Okay? We're talking about the majority of people. Pigs, again, we've talked about scavenging and horses, and they left behind their own mess. And that also conveyed disease, especially in poor neighborhoods where it wasn't likely to be cleaned up and not so quickly used for fertilizer. Thousands of New York City residents, when the pandemic hit, died within weeks. At its peak, 100 deaths a day during July. By the time it abated in December, more than 3,500 people had died in the city, many in the lower class neighborhoods. Another 80,000 people were said to have fled the city. That's to say, a third of the city left, vacated, moved out. Okay. So it's not just that 3,500 people are dead and have to be treated, and the number of people who also had the disease but do get better, but a third of the population flees, taking with them the jobs, the work they do, the money they might spend on consumption in goods. So it creates an enormous economic crisis as well. And cholera would appear periodically because, again, it was very little understood. 1849, it killed over 5,000 New Yorkers, 40% of whom were Irish. In 1854, it killed over 2,500. And then finally, cholera epidemics would continue to occur, but they'd finally abate, become less severe, because finally the Board of Health begins to understand, mostly through scientific understandings that come from England, that poor sanitation causes cholera. The greatest spur to sanitation was not the tax law, was not the desire of rich people to simply create good sanitation. It was to avoid getting sick, and it was to avoid contagion from sick people. So the greatest stimulus to New York sanitation was cholera and the fear of cholera. And that does finally begin to abate. Its sanitation begins to get created. Nonetheless, key to all of this period is to understand that before New Yorkers understood how to contain the disease, New York's history in the first half of the 19th century is measured in how New Yorkers reacted to it. And that was around enormous fear, contagion, and anxiety, especially toward poor people, okay, whom they associate with the disease. Increasingly, it becomes a notion that immigrants and the Irish are diseased people. Okay? That the disease is their fault. It's not the fault of the failure to provide sanitation. It's not the fault, the failure to provide a clean water system. It's understood as a failure of their life, as a kind of just retribution for being immoral, i.e. being Irish, i.e. being Catholic.
Was there any suspicion of Jews causing disease as there had been in the Middle Ages with the Black Plague? Did that exist at all?
You know, not a lot, because they were German Jews. And the German Jews on the whole were, A, small in number, secondly, pretty affluent, bourgeois, middle-class Jews. They tended to be merchants and eventually bankers by mid-century. So there was a fear increasingly. It's an early 20th century fear, and it's complicated because the German Jews participated in that fear against the East European Jews at that point. But that will be a later story, of course. So what we have during this period is the association of the poor with the disease, and that will lead to rapid residential segregation in New York City. Including, by the way, as you'll hear next time, the houses on Washington Square North. They are a product of residential segregation, of rich people wanting to get away. Earlier, you lived near your job. You often lived above where you worked if you were a craftsman or a trader or a merchant. Now, increasingly, there is a new incentive and notion of status to be able to claim that you don't have to live near those people and that you can afford to get away from them. And increasingly, to the extent to which they associate it with the squalor of urban life, they want to be able to live in a grassy suburb. A grassy suburb, which they think of as Washington Square, okay, and increasingly north.
Why would rich people want to live somewhere that overlooks a pauper's field?
I can't hear you.
Why would they want to live somewhere that overlooks onto like a pauper's field?
It's no longer a pauper's field. It's a military parade ground. Okay. It will no longer be a pauper's field, and you put a lot of dirt over it. That's why the gravestone was 2.5 feet below ground and invisible. They make it invisible. And the presumption was that once they're buried, they're not there, okay? And that there's no disease from them. Okay? But it becomes, in fact, reestablished and rebuilt as a respectable space, a place for parading your status. That's why, again, who was the military on the whole? Not poor people, but actually fairly well-to-do people who enjoyed dressing up the way I did in class to come here and stuff, you know. I participate in all this decadent stuff all the time, alas, must confess, right? So it's a different kind of place. Early efforts to clean up, as I pointed out, were limited because most of policy was organized around political patronage rather than health. Health policy was not what dictated early efforts at sanitation. Okay? Rather political patronage, and that meant giving people jobs to clean the streets. So that's the early forms of sanitation, was getting somebody to shovel crap. That's what they did, street cleaning. And on the whole, the streets that they wanted cleaned were their streets rather than poor people's streets. So that's what dictated much of this early stuff was done. Secondly was the problem of doctors, and that's that being a doctor did not require a whole lot of training. Okay? Now we give them a lot of training, they don't necessarily know a whole lot more, but some do. There's a mystification. I'm just teasing there, but there's a mystification. That's why you always ask for a second opinion, right? About what they know or don't know. But then they knew much less. And in fact, it was 6 months training, mostly involved reading a lot of texts. Sometimes they had bodies to work on, and there are real problems, as some of you may know, in the 17, I've got to remember which decade century I'm talking about, in the 1780s of, it's called the Doctors' Riot, because they're accused of stealing bodies for use in the medical schools. So there is some training, but very little. More important, there's very little knowledge, certainly about disease during this period. So they were as likely to cause more disease with their treatment than less. So for instance, they'll say dehydrated, give them more water, but they don't understand that the real issue is the water they're drinking made them sick. So they give them more water, or let's get leeches and let blood. And that did not necessarily solve many problems either. So the understandings of medicine were fairly limited during this period, and that doesn't help very much either. Only in 1849 does the city pass the ordinance to remove pigs from the street. So until then, they're debating it all the time. There are riots about it, but it doesn't happen till then. And remember, when it does happen, the poor aren't exactly thrilled about that anyway, because they're being also told that the pigs that they need for food are being taken from them. So there wasn't a social policy that said, let's make sure we provide food for poor people and get rid of their pigs. It was, let's get rid of the pigs because it's causing disease. So there was no understanding or willingness to entertain the possibility that the problem of the pig was not just the problem of disease, it was a problem of food supplies. So it was just treated as one half. But in 49, they do get rid of the pigs. The other thing worth noting, it's in the 40s that we finally do get a water system that's built. Okay. Where is the New York Reservoir located?
Westchester.
That's where they first collect the water. Where is it in Manhattan? No, further south.
49th Street.
We now call it the New York Public Library. Okay, that's where the reservoir was. We'll move it later. Okay. So that's where it was at that point in time. And that's only in 1840s.
That's on Fifth Avenue.
It is on Fifth Avenue, 41st Street.
Right.
The houses in close proximity led to the easy passing of disease, but they created another problem that we've talked about before and worth reminding us, and that's called fire. The risk of fires was great. Houses were made of wood, and their proximity meant that the fires often accelerated their spread. We've talked about the early fires, right? 1712, 1741, and we've more than been aware of the fears that were associated with those fires. That's to say, the fires were dramatic social events because they became the occasion not just for the burning of the city, but subsequently the burning of people in response to it, okay? Because they animated all kinds of fears that people had at work at the time. 1776, we talked about a fire, remember, as well, during the American War for Independence. Again, almost nothing was done to deal with the fire because the Tories were in control. It was a Tory city. They didn't want to spend money rebuilding the city. Their interest was fighting the war. And about 1,000 houses were burned. There's a fire in 1778 near one of the wharves, and it destroyed 64 homes. There's a fire in 1796 called the Coffee House Slip Fire. Destroyed near Murray's Wharf some 50,000 structures, we're told. That number seems a little preposterous to me, so we're talking about very small facilities. And in May 19th, 1811, another 100 buildings are burnt on Chatham Street. That's to say, when we look for remnants of the city today, finding 18th century remnants is almost impossible. Okay? Even early 19th century remnants is impossible. The city just burns all the time. And if you read a history of almost any American city, as I've told you before, from 1876, the centennial histories, each chapter is usually when a city burns down. Start a new chapter, new buildings are built. The chapters are mostly boosterism, so we'll tell you about the great men who helped to build new buildings when the city burns each time. So it was a way in which fires punctuate and they mark the kind of chronology of the cities because they're often quite destroyed. It allows for new infrastructure, but New York will remain a pretty old city in terms of its infrastructure because ultimately the fires do get contained a little later. Yes?
Out of curiosity, were the fires, did they tend to be seasonal or did they just kind of
No.
come and go like spur of the...
Different times. They were as likely to occur in the winter as in the summer, and why would that be? Fireplaces, and why in the summer? Lightning. Okay, so there was likely to occur in either season. Okay, either season. There were other disasters, by the way. We should note that New York did have other disasters. They were called snowstorms and hurricanes and things like that. One of the major hurricanes was in 1821, called the Norfolk and Long Island hurricane, a storm surge of 13 feet in 1 hour. Probably a Category 3 hurricane. New York does not get large numbers of hurricanes. 1934 was the other major hurricane to hit New York City. The big issues were fires, and the Great Fire was in fact the fire of 1935. This is, I think I probably took this from Gotham, so you probably can see it, but I may have gotten it someplace else. I don't remember any longer. But you get a sense that it wasn't just the risk of fires, but you see the extent to it. Residents crowding into these narrow buildings and the association. Imperfect access to water, but a whole area that's burned. So this is, maybe this will work. Yes. Cohen Slip. Here's Broad Street. Here's Wall Street. So it's Water Street, Hanover Square, Cutler Street, Front Street, South Street. Whole area is basically destroyed. Here's the Battery, so that you get a sense of where you are. Again, remember that while on the map this may not look so big, this is basically from the East River. The Hudson is right over here, so it's halfway across. And remember, Wall Street was the boundary through the first quarter of our history. The area we're now talking about is only up to about here. So this was a fairly substantial part of the developed and thriving life of the city and its commercial core. The key, however, to understanding these fires is to understand something of the conditions that allowed us to put them out or not, because it will spur a very important part of the history of New York for the next period that we're going to be talking about, from the 20s right through the 60s. Who puts out the fire?
Volunteers.
Okay, there were volunteer firemen. There was no professional fire force to speak of. So part of the issue that's going to be created out of all of these kinds of anxieties about when there's a fire, when there's a hurricane, what are the things that people worried about? They worried not about putting it out, but also about theft, about vandalism, about poor people stealing things. Or, from the perspective of poor people, about poor people taking back the things from which their exploited labor had deprived them of the full resources of their labor power. That's Marx's perspective on this, right? But from the perspective of the property owner, the issue was theft. That mandates the need to have a real police force, or a police force, quote, we can rely on. Okay. Well, who's hired to be a policeman? John Jacob Astor going to become a cop? Not very likely. Who's going to be the policeman? Who are you going to hire to be a policeman? Well, first of all, how much money you're a taxpayer, how much money do you want to pay the police? Not too much, right? Got to come out of your pockets. So if you're not paying too much, who's going to be likely to get those jobs? Well, if not quite the poor, working people, right? Working people. And who are the working people? What was their background? What was their ethnicity? They were mostly increasingly Irish. Were the Irish necessarily going to side with the landowners or the occupiers who were English landlords who they'd been fighting in Ireland? Not necessarily. So you have a, as it were, combustible situation about even the problem of who are the police and professionalizing and the firemen. That the people you want to do these jobs are not necessarily people who are going to share your values as to what it means to be a professional or what it means to provide justice. Is justice, after all, the moral economy, or is it going to be this new thing that's going to be created called the market economy? Think of it as a bread price. The moral economy, everybody should be able to get it and afford it. The market economy is, you'll pay whatever I think I can get for it. Okay? So it'll be established by the market, and if you can't afford it, that's your problem. Okay? Go hungry. Well, that's a question about justice that could be determined by these people. So this is in a period in the 30s and 40s that I wanted to talk to you about, in which we not only have disease, we have new changing attitudes about whether this is a moral country around slavery. We have also a transition from a moral to a market economy, with a whole set of new social values taking place, with new ways in which people understand their relationship to one another. It's the difference between the ways in which a German sociologist would have described relationships that are, fancy German words here now, play with me, okay? Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft. Okay? Forget about the fancy terms. Gemeinschaft translates basically as community. Okay? And what does a relationship of Gemeinschaft mean? It's the relationship that family members have to one another. Okay? If you have a family member and they're in need, what do? You give them the shirt off your back. Okay? You don't start saying, well, I'll decide whether I'm really going to give you this money or not. Your family. In Gesellschaft, the word is society. You go into a store, okay, there's new commercial connections, commercial nexus, and you want a shirt, and you go to the salesperson, and I say, gee, I want that shirt, but I'm not your relative. What are you going to say to me? How much? You're going to give me a price, and I'm going to say, well, I can't afford it. And what's your answer going to be? Goodbye. Goodbye. And if I do buy it, there's a price associated with it. Okay? It's not the shirt off my back. There's a different set of social relationships of the buyer to seller. They are an impersonal rather than personal set of relationships. And a market is dictating the price in exchange rather than the moral economy of family and kinship, of sense of community. And that's what's happening in the transformation of New York into this capitalist world, this market economy, which is no longer going to be shaped by barter, by trade, by family relations, but increasingly by market relations. And it's going to change how I relate to my neighbor, how my neighbor relates to the other stranger in the shop, and how ultimately, when people have to go out and work, how husbands are going to relate to their wives and wives to their children. And you should be reading this week with especial care the article by Christine Stanzel for discussion in class, in your discussion section. Okay? Because it gives you an opportunity to talk about the new social relations of production and how they're gendered, the role of men, the role of women, the role of children, where that comes from and how it's transforming the city and the ways in which people get along and survive in the city, in the 19th century city. It is a microcosm of a wonderful, it's actually an article I published, it was her first essay in the early 1880s. She wrote a wonderful book that you can read about all this in much greater detail from Christine Stanzel, City of Women. Read as well. That goes through the 19th century. In any case, that's what's happening with this fire. They call in the firemen. The firemen are a non-professional, volunteer force of people. There wasn't a reservoir. Where are they going to get the water from? There wasn't an adequate reservoir. There's no water system that's very effective. What there are a few places, fire plugs, with fire cisterns, with water systems from wells. Yes?
I didn't understand, why couldn't they just pump
Well, you have to, among other things, have the technology for pumping, and the water is frozen, and it means you can do it along the side, but you can't get it there. Secondly, you've got to have the apparatus, and you've got to be willing to do it. And that means talking about whether the volunteer firemen were prepared to do that. Well, who are these volunteer firemen? Well, they're people who have other jobs. They're volunteers. Okay? They've got lives to lead. Why did they join the volunteer firemen? Why join it? Well, because it's fun. It's a club. All my friends are part of the volunteer firemen. I want to be a part of that group of people. Life is, after all, very hard in the city. There aren't many ways to have fun and do things. Baseball hadn't been invented yet. Takes a few more years. Okay? A firehouse is one of the places where, among other things, you can have camaraderie. You can also share values, and you can have some heat. Okay? In a very cold city. The other place was the saloon. So increasingly, you have these volunteer firemen as clubbing life in New York City, of people who often had been associated together when they were in Ireland. But in Ireland, their clubs were called the Peep Day Boys, the White Boys, the Hibernian Society. And they all organized together as clubs and associations for purposes of solidarity, primarily to do what? To fight the stinking English who were taking their lands. So they reorganized those clubs here as good, loyal Irishmen. And the Americans have their clubs. The Americans, the true blue Americans, they might call themselves. They take on all these kinds of names, and they all have their firehouses. And a fire rings out, and what do you want to do? You want to run there, and you want to control the fire plug and hold it before anybody else gets there, because your prize is that we're the biggest and the best, and we got there first. Putting out the fire is then what we'll go about doing, but we may not do it until the rest of our men all get there. So it wasn't what we would describe as an efficient system of fire protection. It was very good for club life. It was very good for sociability. But it wasn't very good for putting out the fires. And that was particularly appalling to the commercial interests and the insurance companies and to the residents who lived there. So firemen were popular. There were 1,500 firemen. There were 55 engines. There were ladder companies. There were horse carts, but they were mostly fighting one another, the firemen, to get control of the fire plugs, or half the time, or at least that's how respectable New Yorkers saw it. That the problem wasn't just the fire, it was that we didn't have an efficient fire company. The fire begins in 1935 when a watchman notices a fire in a 5-story warehouse on Exchange and Pearl Street. Within 15 minutes, it had spread to 50 buildings. Swept by the winter winds and sub-zero frigid weather, the fire raged for 2 days, and it was argued it could be seen in Philadelphia and New Haven. I don't believe it for a minute. Okay? Maybe Stamford, Connecticut. But that's to say, it had this imagination. It captured the imagination that it was an incredible conflagration, and indeed it was. What it did is it tested the ability of the city to organize and provide public services. And it put that front and center. Are we going to have public services? And who's going to pay for them? And what does it mean to have an efficient public service? And what does it mean to get rid of the firemen? The firemen are going to play an important part of the lecture next week, on Wednesday, rather, you're going to see when it comes part of the story as well. And you'll see how their social role becomes important, because one of the things you're doing in professionalizing is that you may be undermining the solidarity that these firemen have as part of an ethnic working class community. So when local politicians, for instance, election day came, one of the things they wanted were called ward healers. They wanted to make sure that their people all got out to vote and that there was no corruption from the other side. Corruption may have meant that the other side voted at all, or sometimes it meant that they voted their dead bodies. So it was a very loose term, depending on whose side you were on. And both sides used this. But to get the ward healers, they turned first to the firemen as their reliable semi-political organization in support of local ward politics. So you need to understand that these fire brigades are a nascent form of working class immigrant community organizations of both the immigrant Irish, but also working class native born and immigrant English, all in their different groups and clubs, fighting for support. So that the issue of professionalization is an issue that has all these kind of political ramifications about issues around ethnic control, class control in the city. So the fire magnified all the social antagonisms. It magnified the structural weaknesses that lay just below the surface of this city. And again, remember, this is 35, and we're going to be talking next time. I'm going to talk to you about the origins of NYU next time, and that will take us from 31 to 34. Okay, 31 to 34, this material. The aftermath, 700 buildings were destroyed. One account says many more. The area from Bond Street to South Street, from Wall Street to County Slip, down on the bottom, shops, warehouses, businesses, and the like. 23 insurance companies were destroyed. Okay? That was a crucial concentration of the insurance industry of the United States. Only 2 people died, but 400 looters were arrested. So the issue wasn't simply to stimulate fire force, but to also stimulate the creation of a professional police force at the same time, or both of these events. The social problem was evident. Finally, we're going to try to talk about next time a little more. I need to summarize for you a little bit. I talked to you last time informally about the Industrial Revolution, and I tried to suggest that New York City was not a place that was typical of the early model of an industrial city. That's to say, it was not a city with factories or major technology. So if you associate the Industrial Revolution with a textile mill, like Lowell or Manchester, New York wouldn't count. But what historians like Chris Stanzel and another historian named Sean Wilentz, if you go back and look for my edited collection out of which the Stanzel piece came, you'll find another piece by Sean Wilentz in that same collection that would be worth your while to look at from the same period. And he wrote a book called Chance Democratic, which is about this same period in New York City's history. And the term he uses is what he calls Metropolitan Industrialization. And that's one of the things we need to understand is transforming New York in this transition from a moral to a market economy. And what are the characteristics of this metropolitan industrialization that is creating this sense of social unease during the 30s? Well, first of all, the creation of a new work discipline. That's to say, the idea that time is money. Time is money. Not that you got up when the sun rose. You didn't just work when the sun set. You didn't decide to take off St. Monday because you were drunk on Sunday. You were expected now to show up on time by employers who are hiring you by the clock. Okay? By the clock. And you were expected to have new rhythms that required a different kind of discipline to your life. You were expected that to be an efficient and good workman, you must show up when class begins at 11 o'clock. Not 11:10, not 11:15. That's poor discipline. You get marked down for that. You have to be here at 11 o'clock. We're training you to be good industrial workers. So show up at 11 o'clock and you can leave at 11:15 when the next bell rings. We no longer ring bells, but we used to. They do in your high schools, I presume. Teaching you to be good factory workers still. Okay? So that's a new work discipline that's created. Secondly, routinization. Doesn't require a machine to say that every day you're going to show up and every day you're going to continue to work during those hours. And you're going to be involved in doing the same job until you get it right. And you do it over and over again. So the work becomes routinized. That's part of industrialization. The third is what I would describe as that you are now working in the customary form of a demand economy, demand pricing. And that's going to require, for instance, that your remuneration is going to be structured by the market rather than simply the value of bartering of goods that you have. And the prices will fluctuate according to something new called supply and demand. And they'll be given new meaning as having some kind of immutable laws associated with them, as if they were divine. Next, there'll be a new scale of production in distribution and construction. There will be the beginning of what we'll call mass production of shoes. You don't simply produce something for immediate use by one person. You produce it in large numbers so they can be sold and marketed over time. So you'll be working in the mass production. It could be houses that will be sold. There could be ships that later will be sold and used. There could be shoes that are made in large quantities. But mass production will have proceeded apace, and you don't need a sewing machine to do that. You need a needle and a thread and lots of little people doing work. And that brought us to the next part, the division of labor. You no longer are involved, any one person, in making a whole shoe. You no longer even have that knowledge in your head. We don't want you to have that knowledge in your head, because knowledge is power. Instead, the employer wants you to only have a little bit of knowledge, only how to do one piece of it so you can be easily replaced. And your job is easy to do. You don't have to have much skill, because the one thing New York is going to have, and will be easy to have, is lots of cheap, unskilled labor. We're not relying on expensive, skilled labor. It's a city that can welcome all these immigrants off farms or wherever else. You don't have to have much knowledge, because we're just going to teach you a little piece of the project that you can do over and over again in this kind of division of labor. And finally, new social relations of production, which are first of all gendered. Earlier, the work might have been done at home in making shoes, with the husband and the wife and the kids all supervising, working together. Now you go into a textile mills where the young girls work on floors. They're away from their mothers. They have no connection with their fathers. They're overseen by what were quickly imagined as wicked male overseers, lecherous male overseers. And there is some evidence of that lechery. But let's not exaggerate it. The point really is to know that it was there and possible. But the girls are working on their own. You're not working as part of a family unit. You're working now as part of a labor force in a workshop. There are separations of functions, finally. We're getting the last three things quickly. Publishers, editors, newsmen, printers, all with specialized roles. In the past, Ben Franklin did all those things. Now you have separate people doing all of these different kinds of things. You'll begin to have, you don't just make the shoe and sell it, you make the shoe and a shoe salesman sells it in a retail store. Okay? Apprenticeship begins to change and lose its familial moorings. People are no longer living with masters and being trained by a master. In fact, you've got to work on your own and learn the skill in a factory or a workshop, and that meant, since you weren't provided for in this kind of familial apprenticeship setting, you have to go into something new called the rental market. You've got to find a place to live as a boarder, as a renter in somebody else's house. And that dramatically changes relations. And finally, and most fundamentally, we'll pick up next time, is the emergence of a new form of labor called wage labor as a common form of urban social relationship now subject to market conditions. The rise of a manufacturing sector means that goods are produced, somebody's got to buy them, and so workers need money. They need to be given money, they need to be paid money. They need to now work for a wage. And the thing about being a wage is that as a dependent wage system, you can be hired, but you can now also be fired. And that new conditions of dependence will make some workers unhappy, and they protest accordingly. The origins of the American labor movement, born in New York City, not surprisingly, at this time, is the subject of our next lecture.